October 15th, halfway through the month. Tonight's webinar, we're going to have Siobhan Darlington present with us again. These webinars are educational in nature for people to get up to speed on wildlife conservation and research and science. Siobhan's presentation, I think, is going to be around 40 minutes, and we'll do some Q&A at the end of it. And as it relates to this project, the Southern Interior Cougar Project is tied to the Mule Deer Project. So this is kind of a sister project. And obviously, I think you're going to probably see quite a few mule deer in this presentation as well. So trying to put together what goes on out in the wilderness as it relates to mule deer and cougars, and hopefully continue to make recommendations and changes around land management, wildlife management, so that we can help ensure a sustainable future and restore mule deer. So tonight's presentation, as said, will be 40 minutes with Siobhan. She's been on, she's a frequent flyer here. Is this the second or third?
I think my third, yeah.
Third, yeah. So we'll get you a green jacket at some point here. So Siobhan is a wildlife scientist specializing in spatial analysis of animal diet, habitat use and movement in response to environmental change. She has an RP Bio, a registered professional biologist with the College of Applied Biology, and is a PhD candidate at UBC Okanagan, leading the Southern Cougar Project. She is getting into the final stages of completing her PhD and her defense, which we're looking forward to. I assume that'll be sometime in 2025. You know, has been an integral part of our team, both with the Mule Deer Project and the Cougar Project. She's worked with BC Wildlife Federation, Conservation Foundation, Nature Conservancy of Canada, the Mercy Tobiatic Research Institute, Bird Studies Canada, Data University, the UWSS, and the University of Guelph. So tonight she's going to be focusing specifically on population demography and habitats where cougars kill their prey. So for the folks that have seen all of the other mule deer presentations, you'll recall where mule deer really do well and they survive well, and on the flip side, where they die and get eaten quite often. So Siobhan will probably help you tie together the cougar side of that. So Siobhan, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll take care of all the questions and aggregate them and ask them to you at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, BCWF, for having me tonight. So as Jesse said, today we'll be talking about cougar demography, predation, and kill site habitat for cougars. And I'll try to keep it to about 40 minutes so we can all ask our questions and I can get out of the office. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that all of the work that I'm presenting here today takes place on the unceded and traditional territories of the Syilx Okanagan peoples and the Ktunaxa First Nation. And just to provide a recap, I'll go over a bit about what started this project in the beginning and give you a bit of background on cougars in BC in case you've missed some of the webinars I've given before. But I would highly encourage you to watch some of my past webinars. It might be kind of interesting to see where we were earlier in the project to this stage now where the work is almost complete. But for those of you who haven't joined us before, cougars are the widest ranging terrestrial large carnivore in all of the Americas. So they occur from the southern Yukon all the way down to Patagonia, and they used to occur all the way across the eastern side of North America, but were persecuted in the 1800s up until about the 1960s, where cougar management plans and hunter harvest started to become more managed. And so now they're restricted to the western side and beginning to recolonize part of this eastern range. Now, cougars in BC specifically occur mainly on the southern portion of the province. This is historical hunter-harvest records and museum sightings, and we have, over the past couple of decades, more sightings and reports from further north in BC. But most cougars occur in the southern interior and on Vancouver Island. Cougars made headlines in BC about 20 years ago, where they were complicit in the declines of southern Selkirk caribou. So there was a translocation project, and cougars were consuming multiple caribou that occurred at lower elevations. And so there was some research going on in the early 2000s around this in BC and around cougar predation of mule deer and white-tailed deer. But since then, there hasn't been a lot of study of cougars in the province. And in that time, white-tailed deer populations have increased. Now we have this antlerless LEH. in the province and more sightings of whitetails further west than we did before. And then we had this decline in southern interior mule deer in the last decade or so, and that prompted the study of the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project. So that began in 2018, and our project is essentially piggybacking off of this project, and we started in 2019 in 2 of the same study areas as sim deer. So Chloe Wright completed her PhD last year, and her project on sim deer was looking at cause-specific mortality for southern interior mule deer. And for 2 of her study areas that overlap with ours, she found differences in the number of cougar predation events for mule deer. So she found that mule deer were being killed by lots of different things, multiple predators, but that cougars were killing more mule deer in the boundary, relatively speaking, than in the West Okanagan. So they're 2 adjacent study areas. Why might we see such a big difference in the 2 study areas in terms of cougar predation? So we wanted to look at that question. Now, before I get into the details of our work, I want to go over a little bit about our system. And so in the southern interior, we have 4 main ungulates that cougars consume. They can consume some other ones, but these are the primary prey. So we have mule deer, whitetail, elk, and moose. And cougars will predate these ungulates that sustain themselves on available forage on the landscape. So you might think cougars killing ungulates that eat forage and high primary productivity is this linear relationship. But we have to remember that cougars share the landscape with other critters, and they not only eat ungulates, they also eat other prey as well that are smaller, including beaver, porcupines, snowshoe hares, raccoons, urban cats. So there are a number of other things that they also eat. And then they share a landscape with mesocarnivores and other apex predators. And so cougars interact with these other predators on the landscape that also eat the same foods as they do. And so Chloe's project found the mule deer being eaten by multiple different predators that compete with cougar. And cougar, when they kill these ungulates and other prey, are also indirectly feeding some of these scavenging animals like black bears and also birds of prey. So this is a more complex food web than we might think originally. And then cougars are also sharing this landscape with all of these critters and people. So people influence every stage of this food web. We have top-down pressures on cougar populations that include management efforts for conservation, such as for caribou recovery, hunter harvest, competition between cougars and between other predators, and then these bottom-up influences. So landscape development changes the dynamics of plants and plant communities on the landscape. We have more wildfire, beetlebark disease, and climate change. So there are a lot of different interacting effects, and they can be difficult to disentangle. So when we think about the BC Southern Interior, we might not think that this is what the habitat for cougars and mule deer really looks like, but it is. And so you can see that this backcountry area where we have a lot of cut block and deforestation from forestry activity creates this mosaic on the landscape. So we have different stages of regeneration. We have a lot of forest edge, and we have different stages of plant recovery here. So this is a really complex landscape that we need to take into account when thinking about predator-prey dynamics. And there's a lot of study that goes into ungulates using these cut blocks and burns, for example, that are producing new plant growth. But we don't know a lot about how predators are also navigating and using these landscapes. And I like this picture. So this picture is from an intact meadow at high elevation in the West Okanagan, and it overlooks a sea of cut blocks, which is summer range for both cougars and mule deer. And we see this cloud of wildfire smoke above it. And so there are a lot of different forces that we have to contend with here with our predators and our prey. So why do we need to study cougars? Why did we start this whole project? Again, we have this interest in cougars and mule deer, but even more broadly, they're really elusive and difficult to study. There's not a lot of data for the province on cougars apart from hunter harvest records or livestock conflict. We don't have a lot of data on the habitat use of cougars. We need more data on their population demographics and their role in potentially causing declines of other ungulates. And then we don't know a lot about the effects of human use areas and landscape change on cougars. Then lastly, we also have this important influence of these other scavengers that could influence how often cougars have to kill. So there are a lot of different things to disentangle, and we're going to try our best to get at some of these questions. So this brings me to our Southern BC Cougar Project objectives. And so the first is we wanted to collect baseline cougar population data to contribute to the provincial cougar management plan, make better recommendations for the habitats that cougars use and the population itself. We want to understand their use of the different habitat types on the landscape. We want to look at where they make their kills and what prey species they're killing, and look at the effects of those scavengers on how long cougars spend feeding or how often they have to kill. So these are pretty big questions. And today I'll be talking about the first one, population data and kill site selection and their prey choice. And so I talked a bit about how we have the West Okanagan and boundary study areas that overlap with sim deer. And so we have collared cougars, collared mule deer, and cameras in 2 locations. We also have a study area in the Kootenays for cougars. And this is because about 20 years ago, there was a project looking at cougar predation of whitetail and mule deer around this area, including Idaho and Montana. So we can compare some of our results to past data. We also have a lot of hunter harvest of cougars in the system as well to contribute with our population effort. And so we started collaring cougars in December 2019. And in that time, since then, we've collared 53 different cougars. We do this by locating cougar tracks on logging roads in the winter. So we snowmobile looking for fresh tracks crossing the road or along the road. And then if we find tracks that are from the same day, or we can see the whole toe pad and everything, we can release hounds that are trained to track cougars, where the cougars are pursued by hounds and the cougars go into a tree where we chemically immobilize them. And so when we capture cougars, we fit them with a GPS collar, and that transmits a location every 2 hours. And then we also look at the sex and age of the cougar, the body size, and the mass of the cougar as well. And so females tend to be smaller than males. So adult males can be up to twice the size of females. And we've collared more females than males on this project. This partly is because males have larger territories than females, and they tend to overlap 3 to 5 females within their range. So in a given cougar population, the local density of females per male is greater. So we have a better chance of finding females on the landscape when we're searching for tracks. So we age cougars when we capture them by using gumline recession and tooth wear and staining. And so you can see in this picture on the left, we have a 1.5-year-old cougar with pearly whites. There's not a lot of receding gumline, and the teeth are all intact. In this middle one, you can see we're measuring from this bump on the tooth here, how much the gumline has receded. And you can see there's heavy staining and some wear on the canines. And then on this picture on the right, we have a 9-year-old cougar that has seen better days. So she's not killing too many deer these days. And she has a rotting canine, many teeth missing, and heavy staining and wear. So you can see the distribution of the age of cougars that we've collared on this project at the time of initial capture. So the first time we encountered that animal, most of them are below 3 years of age. So we have some females that are older, and we've never collared a male older than 3 at the time of capture. So most of our cougars that we're working with are young ones. Now, we also monitor when females have young with them. And so at the time of capture, they may have young with them, or we document them giving birth from the GPS collar data. And so when a female's collar data shows us locations accumulating in one place for weeks at a time, and she's coming and going to one place, typically in the summer, we identify that that is a den. And so we go in at the 4-week mark and we search on the ground at the den site location for their kittens. And so we sex them, weigh them, give body measurements, and then we also put an ear tag in each of them. That way we can monitor, like the 6-month-old kitten here, we can monitor their progress on trail cameras at the mother's kills. And if that cougar is ever harvested, we can also get information from that as well, since we don't collar them. So we're tracking them from cameras, and if they ever turn up, reported by someone. So the birth pulse for cougars on our project, we found tracks similar to other areas in North America. So it's typically they give birth in the months of July and August, and that's the peak birth pulse. But they can theoretically give birth any time of year, but we haven't documented any births so far in January, February, or April. So it's typically in the summertime. We've documented the types of dens that they've had. So in this case, we had one in October where there was a lot of snow and a Soyuz. And this site was at high elevation, and the snow produced this sort of cave she was crawling in and out of with 2 kittens inside. And then this one here on the right was a slash pile in the middle of a cup block. And you can see the female is with the kittens lying down inside that slash pile. So we document the habitat where they're giving birth as well as how many kittens there are. We also looked at how long females spend with dependent young. So if you're familiar with cougar hunter-harvest regulations, it's unlawful to hunt a female with kittens in her company or kittens themselves that have spots or are under a year old. And so we wanted to look at, well, how long are females actually spending time with dependents? Because they don't always actually spend every moment with their young. They go to dens and then they leave and hunt on their own and make kills and come back to the den. And so females can have young with them between 5 and 86% of their whole life. And so we monitored females of different ages across our study areas, and our median time for females with live dependents that actually lived was about 30% of their time. So with situations where there's a high amount of juvenile mortality, then females have young with them less often because their young aren't making it. So we can see there's quite a bit of range, which might be able to help us guide some more of our regulations, in that sometimes hunters don't know that dependents are actually being cared for by a female cougar. So this is a video that we put up at a den. We had 2 kittens tagged and we put up a camera, and then I looked at the footage and saw this third one that I didn't know was there. So this camera data at the dens can also help us if we miss any kittens when we go in and search on the ground for the young. They're not always together, and we can sometimes miss a kitten when we're tagging them. So we also use the cameras to ensure that we have the correct litter size as well. We look at cause-specific mortality for 2 different age classes: adults that are 18 months and older and juveniles between 0 and 18 months. And so we have them color-coded here by whether the sources of mortality are from human or natural causes. And so you can see juveniles are mostly killed by natural causes. That's largely predation. We've had a number killed by black bears and several unknown predation events that we couldn't determine how they died. And then very few human causes of mortality in the younger age classes. And in adults, it's the opposite. Largely, adults are killed by people and very few natural causes. So I also wanted to show a bit of footage. So this is something that we're looking into with one of our honor students right now. But we've had a couple of close calls with black bears in addition to confirmed black bear predation events of kittens. So this is not very well documented in the scientific literature, and people are only starting to look at this a bit more now because we're seeing that bears are killing young cougar kittens when they're in the den. And this is footage of a cougar with her young at one of her kills, and they're about 2 months old here. And it's not based on the camera data. I picked good clips, but there's about a 30-minute time difference from when the female cougar leaves with her young and this black bear arrives at the kill. And so there can be some close encounters where if the female wasn't with her young at that time, we might have lost those kittens at this kill. And similarly, this is at a den, not at a kill, and some kittens are here, and the female ends up moving these kittens one day before a black bear comes in and is sniffing right where the kittens were. And so we're not only seeing black bears killing kittens, we're also seeing occasions where black bears almost killed kittens. Okay, next. All right, we also looked at survival for cougars. So we pooled all of this data for all the different juveniles we've been monitoring and adults to look at differences between the sexes. So we can see that there's a dip in survival for both males and females when they're very young. This is when a lot of them die from predation when they're in the den. So we see a drop right away shortly after they're born. And then males and females are pretty similar in terms of their survival rates at this stage. So not much difference in the first few months of life. Bears that eat them don't discriminate between males and females. But as they get older, males are a bit riskier when they disperse. They travel larger distances than females do, and they can encounter more issues like livestock, for example, or human encounters, or hit by a car crossing a highway. And so males tend to have lower survival, and as they get older, then they become more susceptible to hunter harvest. And so we see that if we look at just based on our collar data, and this is based on the individuals that we've collared and our smaller sample size, so it's a conservative estimate, but that males have about a 25% chance of making it to age 4 in our population, whereas females have a much higher chance, about 75% chance of making it to that age. And so females can live quite a bit longer than males in our population. They're generally hunted less often than males are. And then we also can look at the time of year when cougars are most susceptible to mortality here. So we can see there's a bit of a dip in July because they're mostly born that time of year, and then they die in the first couple months of life. So there's a dip around the end of summer. And then mostly the dip in survival occurs between November and March when they're hunted. And so we can see for males, that's a much stronger influence than for females. Okay, so that's a quick overview of some of our demographic data. We'll have a report on this pretty soon here with the government. We've also done some density estimate work. That's not part of my project. That's part of the government's work. And so you can stay tuned in the next year or so for some of those results as well, for how many cougars we actually have in each of our study areas. Now I'll move on to talking about the things that cougars kill and where they kill them. So I have a couple of research questions here to look at the relationship between cougars and their different prey. We want to know what is the most abundant prey in cougar diets across Southern Interior BC. We have 3 different study areas. Are they all targeting cougars in each area the same prey species, or are they different? We also want to see whether the rest of the ungulates, are they being killed closest to that most abundant prey because they're occurring in the same places at the same time. We want to see what the relationship is there. And then the habitat features where cougars are killing these different ungulates during 2 different seasons. And we just call them snow and snow-free months, basically winter and summer. And so we'll look at these 4 ungulates again, mule deer, whitetail, elk, and moose, where we had the most data where we could look at these questions. And so to understand what cougars are killing, I described a bit about how cougar dens are identified in our data. We use a similar approach to identifying kills. And so you can see with this GPS collar data here, when cougar locations start to pile up in space and time, we can see a cluster of points. And so this is identified as a potential kill. So what we did is we hiked out, we sent crews, volunteers, a whole army of people over multiple years to go hike into these clusters and search on the ground for prey remains. And so this biases our data set to large ungulates because cougars typically feed for long periods of time and create clusters when they eat something very large. If they eat a snowshoe hare or a raccoon, there's a less good chance that lots of data will be piled up in one place. It doesn't take very long to eat those things. And so this is okay because for our research purposes, we really wanted to get at the large ungulates in the system. And so when we hike into these areas, we search for the carcasses, identify the species that is killed, its age, and also its sex. And while we're there, we also identify signs of cougar predation. And so I wanted to include a bit of information today on how to identify a cougar kill, because this is something a lot of people that are out recreating or hunting on the landscape, they might come across predation events and want to know if that's a cougar kill or not. And so these are the signs that we look for to confirm that the item that we're finding at the cluster was indeed killed by our cougar. Cougars can occasionally scavenge the kills of other animals, and so we do want to make sure that we're representing their diet accurately. And so signs you can look for if you find it at ungulate is a rejected rumen. So this is this green organ here that's usually not consumed by cougars, and sometimes it's buried. There'll be cougar tracks and no signs of anyone else there if you're there early enough. Or look for cougar tracks that look older than other species that might have scavenged the kill. Cougar scat, which doesn't have the tapered ends that wolves and coyotes do, but they're more segmented and square. We also see puncture marks from the canines on the throat or the back of the head or neck. And we can measure the size of those holes and the spacing. We look for sheared hair on the carcass, so a little bit gory or gruesome, but cougars will shear the hair off of their ungulate kills and then use that hair to cover up the body to hide it from other scavengers. And so you might see a cached ungulate with hair covering it and pine needles and snow in the winter. And what we think is pretty funny when we hike into these sites is the cougars think they're doing this great job at hiding these ungulate carcasses. However, we'll often find these huge legs like this elk here sticking out of the ground, pretty obvious, but the cougars think they're doing a good job. Okay, so that's how we identify the signs of predation and collect our data in the field. Now, how do we understand what habitat features are most important for cougars killing these 4 different ungulates? We have several different hypotheses that we're aiming to test. Now, for those of you who don't know a lot about cougars, they're very afraid of people. So they tend to avoid areas where there's a lot of human use, not always, but most of the time. This can cause what's called a predator or human shield effect, where ungulates might choose to occur near to houses or roads or places used by people in order to stay away from predators, because predators will avoid these features. So are we thinking that cougars might be killing any prey just as long as they're not near human use areas? That could be an important driver of spatially where they occur. Are we thinking, well, maybe cougars actually kill their prey in the typical habitat where those ungulates occur? So we would think about rugged terrain for cougars and mule deer, where there's larger intact forest and rugged terrain. So these trees are used by mule deer, for example, in winter, and they can be hidden from predators here, but cougars have an advantage in this more rugged terrain. We might find moose kills because there's wetlands and moose habitat there. So it could be just a virtue of where these ungulate habitats are. Or is it something like this, all of that deforestation that I showed you before? These areas of recent cut blocks and burns can really concentrate prey because they provide this vegetation that's beneficial to them. And so as new plant growth occurs in those huge cut blocks and burns, these ungulates can really benefit from that. And not only are they good for attracting ungulates in the summer months especially, but they also provide good edge habitat for cougars. And so they're kind of the ideal condition for a cougar because they have food, ungulates, using that feature, and they can hide around the edges because there's a lot of forest they can hide behind. And along these edges, there's also usually a lot of deadfall as well. So this deadfall can be difficult for ungulates to get past if they're being chased out of a cut block, for example, very hard to get away. But cougars are very adept at covering more tricky ground. And so this is not stopping a cougar, but it could stop a deer from getting away. So we think that potentially this type of ambush habitat is ideally suited for cougars killing prey. So we want to find out what is the most important thing out of all these different habitat types. So we have these different categories: the ambush disturbance that I just talked about, this human environment or human shield effect, natural habitat, so that intact trees, high canopy, lots of productivity, and natural streams and lakes? Or is it more the terrain ruggedness and elevation aspect of the environment? So our approach is to model these different hypotheses in terms of different models and see which one comes out as the most important for cougars killing these 4 different ungulates, either in the snow months or the snow-free months. Okay, so we'll cover some results here. What did we find hiking into all of these kills? So in the time that we started, I think we did our very first cougar cluster in February 2020. And so since then, we did 1,412 cluster site investigations. And that's with volunteers. I think we had 80 different volunteers, and some were very dedicated. And we had 6 field seasons, 3 summer, 3 winter, with different field crews. And in those 1,412 investigations, we identified 933 confirmed predation events. So you can see they're color-coded here, and I have the main 4 ungulates highlighted. We did find other things. Sometimes we found coyotes or porcupines and raccoons and things like that, but very few of those relative to the ungulates. These triangles are the sites where we hiked in and investigated and didn't find anything. So sometimes we either missed it or it wasn't actually a kill. The cougar was hanging out in an area and wasn't actually feeding. But I want to break this down in terms of the composition of these ungulates in cougar diet for each of these 3 areas. And so in the West Okanagan, you can see in purple, it's largely a mule deer system. 65% of the kills were mule deer versus 11% were moose, the 2 most common prey there. In the boundary, we had 36% of kills were whitetail and 24% were mule deer. And then in the Kootenay, we had 47% of the kills as whitetail and 26% were elk, and mule deer were 3rd. And so we can see this gradient as we move from west to east, mule deer in the west, and as we move east, more whitetails in cougar diet. Okay, so this graph might be a little confusing at first, but I just covered what the main prey were in each study area, and they still match up with the colors here. What I want to show you is that we looked at where cougars spend most of their time. Well, and so we have where cougars spend most of their time searching for food is where they kill mule deer the most. In the West Okanagan. In the boundary, we see that relationship most with whitetails, their primary prey, and in elk and whitetails in the Cougars. So whatever they're killing the most, that's where they're spending most of their time. And we can look at who the nearest neighbor is to a cougar kill. So if a cougar kills a moose in the West Okanagan, what is the nearest animal that it killed? And we can look at this throughout each of our 3 study areas, because we're trying to look at whether these prey of different species are in fact congregating in the same places. And so mule deer, if you remember, were 65% of the kills. So it's really mule deer system that's dominated in the West Okanagan. And if you are an elk, moose, or a whitetail that is killed by a cougar, you're being killed closest to another animal that's been killed, which is a mule deer. The same thing we can see in the boundary here, but it's whitetail that are the dominant prey. So if you are a moose, mule deer, or an elk, you're most likely killed near to a whitetail. And in the Kootenays, it's both elk and whitetail deer that the other ungulates are being killed close to. And so we don't have a lot of data for moose. You can see the sample sizes here in the boundary and Kootenays, but overall you can see that whatever the main prey is for cougars in each system, if you're the other type of prey, you probably don't want to be hanging around the main prey base. So this is a picture up here of a moose killed by a cougar, and right beside it, it also killed a mule deer. So right back to back. So if I don't really want to be a moose in the West Okanagan hanging around mule deer, for example. And I don't want to be a mule deer in the boundary hanging around whitetails. So you might be able to see where I'm getting at with some of this. We have some top models for the habitat where we're finding these kills. That's just spatially before what animals are killed nearest to who. In terms of the different hypotheses I laid out, we have some results here. So remember, we looked at the human avoidance hypothesis. Cougars shouldn't kill things near where people are. We looked at ambush habitat from disturbance. We looked at natural features, terrain, and then we had a null model, which is just cougars killing everything at random. And so we have our results for the snow-free months. For elk, our top model was the ambush disturbance hypothesis. Cougars are killing elk most often around habitat that were regenerating cut blocks and burns, about 10 to 20 years old. We had the same result for moose. The top model was the ambush disturbance, mule deer again, and whitetail. So all 4 of our main ungulate species are being killed in the same habitat types by cougars. And so this really speaks a lot to the role of these different polygonal features that are recovering over time. So we did look at 2 different stages of regeneration that I showed on the slide before, the 0 to 9 year mark and 10 to 20. And we found that the 10 to 20 mark was more important for cougars killing these prey. So over time, when these plants are recovering, at the intermediate stages, if you can see my cursor, there's sort of a new cut block, an intermediate one, and the older intact trees. It's this intermediate one that is more risky for cougars killing those different ungulates. In the snow months, though, in winter, so cougars are killing prey on winter range. And so what did we find for that? We didn't have enough data to look at elk because cougars mainly killed both elk and moose in the summer months that are juvenile. And so we had very few adult moose and elk killed to do this analysis in the winter. We could only look at the 2 deer species. And so mule deer were killed mostly in natural habitat, old stands on their winter range that are intact, so away from disturbance. And then whitetail had more to do with terrain, so killing them at low elevation and less rugged terrain. And so we don't have the same model for deer in the winter, and it's not the disturbance hypothesis. And so our winter predation of deer, both species, is more a reflection of the natural landscape. But our summer predation of these ungulates has a lot to do with the disturbance on the landscape. And so I put it in stars, everyone. So cougars is killing all 4 ungulate species here in these regenerating cut blocks and burns in summer. And what I want to point out is that we included distance to those features and also the height of the canopy. And so it's not simply that they're within these features, but also around taller canopy around them. And so if you think about edges around these habitats, these ungulates are likely foraging in the centers or within these features. And then near to them or on the edges, there's taller trees. And that's where the cougars are dragging these kills and predating these ungulates. And so the edges of those habitats, like this green area here along the edge of a burn, that's a risky place to be. And this is a map here. So I wanted to project this relationship in terms of the distribution of these different habitat types on the landscape. And so I had 4 ungulates to use for the snow-free months, and I mapped out the habitat where cougars are making these kills. So this is not a map of where cougars are most abundant. It's not a map of where the ungulates occur most. It's a map of the habitat features distributed on the landscape that we're finding support cougar predation. And so you can see intermediate aged burns like the Okanagan Mountain Park burn, for example, is lit up here on the map as being important grounds. And then you can see different cup blocks as well in here. And then in the winter months, it's more about the more natural winter range of these ungulates. And so you can see mule deer winter range is pretty lit up here, and then low elevation areas in the boundary where we have whitetail. And so there are different habitat features that are facilitating these dynamics. And I really wanted to hone in here on this regen habitat. We took a lot of photos doing these kill sites, and you can see what it's like on the ground. So it's one thing to map it. So this is in, you can see on the left here, I have my map where I predicted where cougar kills are using this habitat. And you can see the polygons here, all these different cup blocks. And some of them are really complex. So what I want to point out here is that the more complicated a cup block is, or a feature, the more perimeter it might have. And the more perimeter you have, the more forest edge there is. And so these more convoluted cup blocks could provide a lot of ambush habitat for a cougar relative to a more simple one. So that's something we could potentially look at in the future. We weren't able to look at the type of cup block specifically in this project, but that would be a really cool thing to do in the future. And this is what some of these kills look like. This kill was right on the edge of a cup block and among tons of deadfall. A lot of them are around fallen debris. And you can see when these start to recover how well a cougar could hide behind some of these regenerating trees to sneak up on its prey. And so you can see how these animals are getting killed in this type of landscape. And we can think about this landscape being important for feeding ungulates, but it's also benefiting predators as well. Okay, so to summarize, mule deer are important prey in winter in the west, whitetail in the east. We have different prey that are most abundant in cougar diet. That could be a reflection of the actual numbers of those prey in the landscape, but we couldn't measure that. We didn't have cameras in every single study area. So we're hoping that in the future we can get at that data a bit better, or another student can do this. So for now, I'm calling it the most abundant prey in cougar diet. It could be the most abundant prey that's simply available on the landscape. We found that these ungulates were being, no matter who you were killed closest to the primary prey in cougar diet. So if mule deer are the big, preferred prey in the West Okanagan, anybody else hanging around mule deer could be at risk of predation because cougars are honing in on where those deer are. And similar to in the Kootenays, they're honing in on where the elk are more than they are mule deer. So you could be in the wrong place at the wrong time if you're this other ungulate type. If we're thinking about conservation and some of these less abundant prey in the diet are important and we want to maintain them, then we need to think about the overlap between those primary prey and these less abundant ones in space and time. And that relates to the habitat that they're both using. And so we found that all 4 of these ungulates were being killed in the same habitat types, and those models were being strongly predicted across all of them. So more than other habitat features, these cup blocks and burns that are regenerating were really important for where cougars were successfully killing animals. And so we need to think about some management recommendations here, because we think a lot about how cup blocks are good forage for deer, and we think about restoring seismic lines and roads to slow down wolves, but we don't think a lot about how we can manage cup blocks to slow down ambush predators. And so cup blocks and burns could be the equivalent of roads for wolves in terms of facilitating predation on the landscape. And there's no signs of cup block creation slowing down anytime soon. And so we might need to think a bit more about how to restore some of these features to make them less lethal. And so minimizing the creation of those edges, some smoother lines, fewer edges per polygon would be great. And minimizing the effects of this deadfall, because I've been out in the field and I've seen a cougar traverse deadfall right in front of me. and it had no problem. We struggled, the hounds struggled, the deer struggle, and the cougars don't struggle with the deadfall. And so there could be some management actions on the ground that we could do to improve the situation for deer. So if they're taking advantage of these cut blocks, ensuring that we're not also making it ideally suited for them being killed. Okay, next steps on this project are for me to finish this thesis. And I have two students currently that are taking on different other aspects of this project. And so one is looking at den site selection for cougars, where they give birth and the habitat that they need to reproduce in. And the other student is looking at scavenging black bears and coyotes and their influence on how long a cougar spends feeding on their kills. So like I mentioned earlier in the talk, there are other dynamics other than prey numbers and habitat type that can influence cougar predation. And we want to look at the role of scavengers in this food web. And then we're also contributing this baseline data, as I mentioned, to the Provincial Cougar Management Plan and to a demography report coming out soon. And then lastly, we have a completed project that is about to be published, looking at some of the camera data we put up. So a number of volunteers helped us with this as well, putting up trail cameras on cougar kills, and then we analyzed what animals were there. We had Ashley Giovannini, who went in and investigated the different dynamics between scavenging birds on these cougar kills. It's a super cool paper, so I highly encourage people to look out for it, looking at how bald eagles, ravens, and turkey vultures interact on these kills. Okay, so thank you to our project team, volunteers, funders, and partners. Like I mentioned, it was an army of people over the last almost 5 years now, collecting all of this data. If you've ever been to a cougar kill, it is not usually easy to access. It's very difficult and hard on the knees. And so a huge thank you to everyone who's participated and supported this work. Okay, I can take questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Siobhan. Oh, my computer might be seizing up a bit. First, I've got a few questions. Given the variability in both the time mother cougars spend with dependents and the temporal variability of when they can give birth, how can we accurately determine if a female does not have any cubs for hunting regulations?
How can I accurately determine when she doesn't have cubs?
Does not, yeah.
Yeah, so we can only look, we put cameras up every couple of months. So there are definitely times, it's probably a conservative estimate because we can't always tell if a kitten is still with the female, if the female's collar stops working. So in the approach we use, we censor data when we no longer receive any monitoring data from them. So whether we think they've died or we just don't have any data anymore. So the approach accounts for our lack of information. So we only use information that we actually have to estimate the amount of time they spend with these young. And accounts for the number of monitoring days as well. So some cougars we've had monitored, for example, I'm going to a den on Friday, and we have been monitoring this cougar since 2020. It's the longest cougar collared on the whole project. And I think she's lost 4 litters. Not one has been successful. But she has a high number of litters and longevity of monitoring days. And some cougars we've monitored for only 3 months, and we couldn't tell if her kittens were still with her or not. And so it's accounting for the amount of time we're actually monitoring them. So this is likely a conservative estimate, but it's the best data we have currently for how long they actually spend with the young. And again, the median is about 30% because we have a pretty high mortality rate in the young, about 46% survival for juvenile cougars to year 1. And so if they lived more, then we might have females with young longer. Yeah.
Thanks. One question that I have a question too. You talked about wintertime mule deer in old stands in I think natural habitat or something to that effect. How does the fire suppression piece tie into that then? I guess I'm asking a leading question, but a pile of this country is really, really growing in. And so I guess what I'm saying in part is when we look at Chloe's work and what her PhD found and what you're finding is in these places where we would have had fire every, say, 15 to 30 years in a whole bunch of these places, and we no longer have fire, like maybe I'll let you take it from there. Because I guess what I'm saying is we're calling it natural habitat, but it's kind of an I'm not sure if the word is unmanaged forest. It's a Smokey the Bear
Right.
forest. So So we're in part, moving into the land of white-tailed deer versus moving into the land of mule deer.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, basically, we looked at fire in all seasons and everything like that, but it's hard to analyze something that could have been there and isn't, right? So on these winter ranges that haven't been burned in a long time, it's hard to know how they would respond. I mean, cuplocks are in that system on winter range, and they don't use them very much because of all that snow accumulating and not very good access to food in that. So we didn't find that cuplocks and fire on winter range were important for deer. Being killed, that is, not that's not good for them in terms of their survival. So my data just looks at when they're dead and not when they're alive and benefiting from it long term. So one thing Chloe and I have been talking about a bit is that her work looks at what factors are risky for mortality for mule deer. And one of her biggest findings was that roads were really important. So roads promoted in winter range higher mortality in mule deer. And so we looked at roads from the perspective of cougar predation and didn't find that roads were significant at all in our project for this question. And so it's interesting to think about, well, cougars are the main predator for mule deer in her project, but roads are a higher source of mortality. But it's not coming from the cougars. So what is the road mortality associated with is a good question for winter range. So we didn't find that relationship, like the cougars were that part of it. She looked at all sources of mortality for this. So roads related to mortality from lots of different things. But yeah, in terms of the fire suppression piece, I think it would be really cool to do some monitoring of burns in winter range, for example. I think there's some ideas around prescribed burns for winter range to see how that would impact their habitat use. And I'm not sure how that would impact predation, because in other studies they found forest edges were also important in winter. We found that that wasn't as important in our system, and it could be the lack of edge in the winter habitat range. So for example, if you had maybe more edge habitat in the middle of winter range, it could also benefit cougars based on how they use that habitat in the summer. So yeah, it's a good question. We need more data on it for sure.
Perfect, thanks. There's a little bit of discussion about bottleneck corridors like agriculture, orchards, that sort of thing. I don't know if that might be outside of your world, but if it's inside your world, maybe take a run at it.
Is there somewhere I can read the question?
It says, what about bottleneck corridors for large agricultural practices such as cattle and orchards?
Yeah, so we do have quite a few ranches and orchards in our study area, especially in the West Okanagan. A lot of it is that. We do have some cougars that are in overlap with that habitat. We only had one predation event on the whole project of a cow being killed by a cougar, and it was a cow calf on a ranch, and it was near a forested area on the edge of the rangeland. So we didn't have a lot of data to look at that question more within that type of cultivation. I included cultivation in my models, and I couldn't include it because we didn't have enough cougars actually in that habitat to include that variable. And so while we have cougars that are in and around them, they're not really using it like cultivated areas. So it could be a good place to be if you're a deer, because we don't have the cougars really using that habitat type. But I don't know a lot if the deer or prey are using areas associated with people in terms of agriculture and farmed lands to stay away from cougars. The cougars don't seem to go for very many livestock on our project anyway. We have some kind of semi-urban cougars, but most of our cougars are in backcountry areas away from that.
Thanks. Implications for, I guess it said for planting monoculture used by industry. I guess really this ties to forestry practices. So at this stage, any kind of management recommendations, and there's a few questions around edges and that sort of thing. So any management recommendations around forestry specifically? How's that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something so as I'm writing up the results from this work, trying to dive a bit more into that, because I mean, I don't have a forestry background. But what I'm finding is that what could really be important to remediate in these features is the windfall effect. So in Cuplack specifically, you have these really harsh forest edges, whereas in forest fires that are typically less intense, there's some stand still intact. And so the edges are less abrupt on the landscape, whereas for cuplocks, we have these really like firm edges between intact forest and nothing. And those really harsh lines, if they're on south facing slopes, they get more wind that can fell. It fells a whole bunch of trees. And so that's where we find a lot of our cougars denning. When we go to den site investigations, a lot of them are on the edges of cut blocks within all of that thick debris where you can't even see the ground. And we do find some of our kill sites are in that as well. And so thinking about, well, how do we plant trees maybe in stages or cut trees differently so that the edges isn't so harsh, so that wind is causing huge amounts of tree fall all the way around it. Because sure, deer can take their time and cover through and traverse that habitat when they're going in to forage. But if they're being chased by a cougar, I don't think that they can really escape a lot of that, those huge piles of deadfall and debris very easily. And we see when we go to these kills, especially fawns that are shorter, so they're smaller and they have a smaller stride and they can't cover and jump as high as adults. We see a lot of the young deer and moose and elk that are killed by cougars in the spring. A lot of those are basically run into logs on the edges of those features. And so limiting that, I think, could be important. It's important to include deadfall in a natural system, but I think that these types of harsh edges artificially increase the amount of deadfall, specifically along the edge of the forest. And so we do need to keep some for natural remediation, but not have so much stacked up that it's causing problems for our ungulates.
Awesome. Okay. A number of questions. Can you just kind of elaborate on diet, cougar diet? And so, you know, people want to know kind of how many deer, elk, or moose, or is it like a per pound calculation? I'm sure you had this question a number of times. How much do cougar eat?
Yeah, so the average kill rate for cougars, a lot of studies look at it and they get very similar answers across where they eat deer. It's usually 1 deer-sized prey per week is what sustains 1 cougar. And so a female that has young that are older, like a year old, and they're still traveling with mom and she's feeding them, they kill more often. It's once every 3 days usually. And so they have to kill more often because they have more mouths to feed. The same size prey, still killing deer, but just more often. Males can kill larger prey. We found males killing adult moose and elk more than females were, given that males are also larger than females. That probably makes sense to a lot of people why a bigger cougar could kill a bigger prey. And so we didn't measure how much cougars were consuming pound for pound. I mean, that was really hard to get at. There was one study that did this where they hiked in something like every day and they measured how much food a cougar was actually eating on a kill and how much carcass was left. And it was a huge experiment where they had to do this for hundreds of carcasses and monitor very closely. So that wasn't one of our objectives. We weren't looking to measure exactly how much energy intake they have and compared to their kill rates. More so, what are the main large ungulates that make up their diet? We have other methods of looking at diet too that we've done on this project. This is the kill site selection piece and getting data from kills, but we've also looked at their scat. So collected scat on this project and looked at metabarcoding. We've gotten a number of other prey items and scat identified. And then we've also done stable isotope analysis as well from both cougar hair and cougar whiskers. And so we could get more long-term data on the diet from the whiskers. But there are different issues with each method you look at for using diet comparisons. And so for this piece, we looked at just the kill sites and just proportionately of the kills that are above an 8 kilogram animal. So kills that are substantial enough that they cluster. What were the proportions of the food that they're eating? And on average, this is about across the range, 80% of their diet in North America is large ungulates. So we're missing about 20% of the diet by doing this approach. Which makes up grouse and snowshoe hare and things like that. That's not included in these estimates. So when I say 65% of kills are mule deer in the West Okanagan, it's 65% of kills that we went to that are above 8 kilograms. And so probably 65% of 80% of the diet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so people want to specifically know like how many pounds of large ungulate per year per cougar. Do you have an average? There's some stuff that there's, you know, people have looked at it. I'm just wondering if you have that. That's what people are wondering is how many.
No. So that's to estimate that you would have to do what people do to estimate that is they have to go to every single kill a cougar makes for months at a time. So it's very field intensive for a couple of animals. animals. So we didn't do that on this project. We wanted to sample many different animals as much as we could to get a better estimate for the population, not just a couple of cougars. And so that question, there are papers that have looked at that. So you can look this up and look at the studies that literally tracked a cougar and went to every single item that they ate to estimate that. But this isn't something that we could do on this project.
Thanks. Now, lots of questions about the status of cougar populations in the study areas and density and how the cougar populations are doing. And I know you guys worked on a paper on that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we did some density work. This is with the government, however, so I'm not leading that study. That's with Garth Mowat, provincial carnivore specialist. So he is leading a density estimate for the West Okanagan, and they should have results for that pretty soon available. So that work was done in 2021, biopsy sampling and hair sampling cougars in the winter in our West Okanagan study area to obtain an estimate of how many cougars are there in that study system in the winter, and then what the density is. And so they've done that work already for West Okanagan. Our goals were to do it for each of our 3 study areas. And so the plan is to do, we were trying to do it in the boundary last year, collect the data. However, we had a horrible winter. I'm sure a lot of people remember. We didn't have snow on the ground in a lot of our range in February. We were snowmobiling on dirt. And so we couldn't find cougar tracks because there was not enough snow. So we weren't able to get the data to biopsy sample cougars last winter in the boundary. And now that's been postponed at least another year. So that'll be a little while before we get estimates for each of these 3 places. But the idea there is to compare the density of the cougar population in each of the 3 places and see if the density might be higher in the boundary where cougar predation of mule deer that were collared was 3 times higher than the rate in West Okanagan from Chloe's work. But our project shows that the majority of cougar predation events in the boundary is whitetail. And so the only way that can line up is if there are more cougars there than we think there are. And so if there are more cougars being supported by whitetail on the landscape, they could be killing more mule deer than average. Or another alternative is what we're looking at with the scavenging, is if we have higher rates of scavenging pushing cougars off the kills, and there's not more cougars, there are just fewer cougars that are killing more often. And so that could be also part of the story here. So we are trying to link all these different things together. There are a lot of different explanations that could, explain some of the trends we're seeing. But we're going to have to wait a little while to get the density estimates to see if that's the case, because that's one of our hypotheses, is that there are just more cougars there.
Okay, sorry, I thought I had seen it, but maybe I've just seen a draft. Okay. Are you aware, are there any cougar projects on Vancouver Island?
There have been a few small projects. There is a completed project, and I believe the report is public, on Northern Vancouver Island. There's an elk study taking place, and they did this biopsy density estimate work with cougars. This is led by Carl Morrison in the province. That work was done a few years ago. So they have results for cougar density there. So they did this first, and then we did our density estimate after them in West Okanagan. So our results are coming in after theirs, but that is the most recent Vancouver Island project. There have been some other projects in the 90s looking at cougar diet. One of them had seal in cougar diet and all these like marine critters, which is pretty cool. But that's from the mid 1990s. And then there's a couple of smaller projects with camera trapping on cougars on the island.
Awesome.
Yeah, but that's about as much as I know.
Yeah. Have your collared cougars, are they using Forest Service roads to travel during the winter? I think we covered this a little bit, but.
Yeah, so in terms of their killing, kill site patterns, roads were not significant in winter, so they weren't avoiding or selecting them. We also find when we track cougars that they don't tend to follow roads. So we spend a lot of time when we're looking for cougar tracks looking on roads, right? We're snowmobiling on the roads. We see wolf tracks, coyote, bobcat walking down roads very often. And for long durations, anytime we think we're confused by a track, if it's a wolf or a cougar because it's been melted out, we see how long we have to follow it for, because cougar tracks are never that long in a road. And so there might be a couple 100 meters, they follow a road and then they veer off. So they usually just cross it. We don't see in real time when we're actively tracking them, we don't see a lot of use of the roads by cougars. usually just cutting across and continuing on, and usually into canyons where they're difficult to catch. And then based on our collar data itself, we don't see a lot of use of roads in the winter. We did see in the summer months or snow-free months in this work, they killed more often closer to roads in the summer. And so that could be because they're killing ungulates more in these cuplocks and burns, and there are more roads that go into cuplocks. And so that could be partly why we see a slight trend there. It wasn't super strong, and also wasn't in the top 3 models that we ran. So other habitat features were more important than roads in guiding cougars to kill their prey.
Okay. Yeah, we need to do sim deer, cougar, and the sim deer camera work. Like there's a link there that we're missing. Okay.
Totally.
I'm not sure how much you're up to speed of the stuff north of Revelstoke. Can you speak to the effect of cougars on endangered caribou north of Revelstoke? I don't know, I'm not sure if you're up to speed on that. That might be a Rob question.
Well, this is something that's actually being studied by the Chilcotin Cougar Project. So this is based out of PG in the Williams Lake office. There's a cougar study currently with Chris Johnson and Shane White looking at cougar predation of caribou. So they have a whole other cougar project, very similar to ours, collaring cougars, investigating kills within caribou habitat to look at the effects of cougar predation, how often they kill caribou, if it's males only or females. So there's no caribou in my study system, so that's not a question that I can answer. But there is an entire other project that's specifically looking at that. And it's called the Chilcotin Cougar Project. And they have updates available as well on that project and how it's going.
And there's one for north of Revelstoke that I think Corey Bird was the lead on it. I'll just post it in the post it in the chat.
That was they had a couple of cougars. This is more than 15 years ago, I believe.
Yep.
But they had 4 cougars collared for that project. So a smaller scale project. They didn't look at very many cougars. But yeah, given the gaps we have with cougars and caribou, because a lot of what we know about them is from the failed translocation project. And so to get a better sense of caribou that are actually used to that habitat and have a predator response and know where to go to avoid predators, they're doing this bigger study up north where they have them. And they're also looking at the Chilcotin study. This is really around the edge of cougar range as well in BC. So there are fewer cougar there. Typically, from what I understand, from all my readings on it, the cougar densities are much lower in these environments as well because there are fewer deer and it's around the periphery of their range. So you don't get as many cats and there's less food available for them in those areas. But wherever you have deer, you probably also have cougars.
Awesome. Okay, so you kind of covered this, but we'll go through this. Are you seeing more kills found in the cupblock edges? Curious if felines are adapting in such a way. So you might not have the learned behavior thing, but can you again just speak on where you're finding or what the proportion is in terms of cupblock edges and kills?
Yeah, I don't have the proportion. We looked at like distance to these burns of different age classes and we modeled it. And so rather than just getting a simple, proportion, we looked at multiple different factors, but it was significant for all 4 predated ungulates. And so we had a significant amount of kills occurring within or close to regenerating burns and cuplocks that are 10 to 20 years old is what I would call them. We would call the young ones about 0 to 9 in our study. And so, yes, we did have quite a few during those summer months. And part of the reason for that too is that I didn't show it on this presentation, I've shown this in past webinars, is the breakdown of the age classes of these ungulates cougars are killing seasonally. And so in the summer months, cougars kill a higher proportion of juvenile ungulates. So they kill more moose and elk calves than adults for sure. And they increase predation of moose and elk because they're killing young ones. And then they also increase predation of juvenile and neonate deer. And so those animals, those 4 ungulates, not only forage in those habitats, they also give birth in them. And so cougars are taking advantage of those ungulates, not only using them after a harsh winter and feeding themselves, but they give birth to their young there. So if you look at Chloe's work, a lot of her neonate mule deer are born around cuplocks. So we did a lot of surveys with Chloe in cup blocks scanning for neonates. And then I also find neonates killed by cougars there. And so there's kind of lots of things that attract ungulates to feed and reproduce in those areas, and then lots of factors that make them lethal for cougars, killing them. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Now, I don't know if you are, from what you've seen in terms of your cougars, I guess at the individual level and the population level, the question is, are they essentially, how comfortable or uncomfortable are they around humans?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, we went to, like I say, 1,400 and some clusters, most of them within a week of them being formed. The cougars are still feeding on a lot of them. And I think I've seen a cougar sitting on a kill one time on this entire project because they're so afraid of us hiking into the kills that they're long gone by the time we walk up to them, and we're just two people. We've had them run away from us approaching. We've had them not come back to kills if we've gone and disturbed the site too much. They won't return if we've been there. We had to stop visiting one cougar's kill because she was so afraid of us that she wouldn't eat anything if we were disrupting her. And so we stopped visiting that cougar's kills because she had such a strong response to people. We have had cougars in a semi-urban area. I think we've had 7 or 8 cougars kind of use urban areas. We had one cougar around Penticton. We had one in the Myra Canyon. We had several that dispersed and ended up around urban areas on this project, and we tracked their dispersal patterns. 2 of them ended up outside Spokane. All of our cougars that were in and around human use areas were killed by people on this project. So none of them survived the duration of the project. They all ended up being killed from livestock conflict, an encounter with a person, hunting, anything like that. Whereas our cougars that avoid people, we've had fewer mortalities from humans. And so there's probably a good reason why cougars are fearing people. It's the greatest source of mortality of adults. And we've documented that. The ones that don't have a spear or don't leave human use areas end up dying. And so I would say very strong. You know, you always do get those stories of cougars that approach people or that have attacked a dog in the presence of a person. And those are overall, in terms of the population, rare events. And oftentimes there's something wrong with that animal. It's injured, starving, or something else. And so there have been a couple of cases of cougars interacting with people in the Okanagan during our study that weren't collared, but we found out about them that had porcupine quills lodged in them. They'd gone to kill a porcupine. They got lodged, couldn't eat anything, and were just starving and desperate and attacked dogs. And so typically a healthy cougar will not be around people.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is similar to the world of bears. It's a learned behavior too, if you're around people, but if you get shot, then there's no one to teach, right? So if you're a female, it's hard to teach kittens. That's kind of the challenge with bears, is some of the genetic, the DNA shows that it's a learned behavior, but the learning stops really quickly when you die.
When you die. Yeah, we had one female that was she's dead now, but she lived for years around the Kelowna area. She was a mature female, and we tracked her. We went to her kills. They were always deer. She never killed a domestic animal. She was a smart cat. You know, this cat had figured out how to live on the landscape. And I had people, sometimes I'd have emails from people, you know, a week straight of garage footage of this collared cougar walking past their driveway. Like, people kept seeing her at their property, but she would never kill a pet. We went to a lot, we collected isotope data from her. There was no sign of domestic animals in her diet. And so she was really adapted to it, but she had 2 litters in the time that we monitored them, and her litters were all in conflict with livestock. So they were unable to learn. And then she ended up persisting on this landscape. And anytime her young got into trouble, she was out of there. So it's pretty cool. I think she struggled to teach her young to stay away from those sources of prey. She knew better, but the young couldn't learn, you know.
Awesome. Okay, on average, this is not an average question, how much of a prey carcass remains when they're done or when they get bumped off of it, if there's an on average?
Yeah, it really depends. So it's very individually based. So we've had males that will just eat the organs and leave the whole rest of the carcass and don't come back. They only eat the good stuff and move on. We've had females do that. We've had females with young do that. We've had some of the individuals, male and female, consume every last bit of the carcass. And so this would be a cool question to look at, because what I've observed is that this has a lot to do with the strategy that they use. So whether they're killing more often just to eat the good stuff, or whether they actually camp out at their kills. So some cougars on our study, both males and females, will lay down and bed right at the kill. And so the kill is essentially being defended by them from scavengers. So we don't see on our cameras that we put up very many scavengers come in when the cougar is actively there, and the cougar will feed more on it. But if the cougar beds, sometimes they bed a kilometer away, and they come back and they pick off pieces, they stay a couple hours, they go back to their bed, and they return back and forth. And this can happen a lot. They're getting less food, and then their food is not being defended from scavengers that take a lot of that food away. And so it really depends what strategy they're using. If they bed further away, they're less likely to encounter these scavengers and enter into conflict, but they get less food out of it. And so I think a finer scale analysis of this kind of data would be really cool. And we might have the data for a student to look at that in the future, given we have so much camera data with the cougars still there and the collar data showing them going back and forth when they're feeding. So it's not something I could look at specifically, but I think the data is probably there to look at that for someone else.
Sure.
But it's completely, from what I've seen, an individual-based behavior. Whether they have young, whether the young are kittens, whether the young are a year old, and she has 4 mouths to feed versus 1. So the amount of food left over totally depends. Yeah.
I think there's a paper too that talks about it being a temporal issue too. So like in the spring when bears are out, they can bump cougars off of their kills, which results in cougars needing to kill more. So there's probably a piece there. Okay, CWD question. Are cougars and other predators susceptible to CWD if they kill an infected ungulate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I saw it in the comments, so I did look this up because I don't study this in this project, but there are a few papers recently published on this. So I encourage anyone out there who's interested to Google and read them, but I can give you the cliff notes. Is that one recent study did look at cougars killing and consuming CWD infected deer to see whether cougars were infected themselves and whether they transmitted prions on the landscape. And it's really cool. I mean, I can't remember the name of it. I looked it up a week ago, but they found that cougars are not susceptible to CWD. Predators aren't typically influenced by that. It's specific to ungulates. So they're not diseased themselves, and they consume and degrade 96% of the prions from the carcass they're eating. And this study looked at cougars defecating after consuming an infected deer or ungulate, and to see how many prions were in the scat and how long after they ate it were they sort of dispersing the prions. And they found that it was only the first time they defecated, there were some in the scat and then none after that. And so their conclusions were the cougars are actually really good at getting rid of them on the landscape, and they tend to target more sick deer, the deer they're more easy to kill. So they could be a really good way to reduce the spread of prions from infected deer in the population. They're not infected themselves, and they actually get rid of a lot of those prions through their body. So that's really cool, and I encourage people to read it because it's a recent study within the last year. But not something I looked at because we didn't have CWD in BC during my study up until recently.
Yeah, I got it now. Okay, how long typically does a female keep her kittens for?
Yeah, so we found, I had that graph I showed earlier, but it really varies. So between 5% of their life, so total time that we monitored them, or up to 85% of the time. And so we had some females, for example, that have young, and their litter I'm going to on Friday, I think it's her 4th or 5th litter, and they keep dying. And so she doesn't have kittens with her most of the time because they keep dying, mostly because she abandons them and doesn't feed them. Other cougars, they can reproduce and have young with them for a year, and then they kick them out, so to speak, and those individuals are no longer with mom, and she might reproduce right away. Or a lot of mothers have a 2-year interval, so they'll have young with them for a 1.5 years, and then they're sort of single and without any dependence for about 6 months, and then they'll reproduce again. And so it really depends how successful the female is at rearing her young, if they have a lot of food available to them and they can have more kittens, and then whether they have them with them for a year and reproduce right away and that subsequent litter is successful, or if they have them for longer. And so it's, again, one of those individual based situations. We see a lot of variation in our project. Some females are really great mothers and others not so much. So that's why we have that median of about 30% of the time, but it ranges from 5 to 86. Yeah.
Okay, another one, really, I guess, related to any instances of infanticide or, you know, males killing females or any of that stuff.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I didn't get into too much of the sources of mortality, but we did have it in there. We've had, in all of the clusters we went to, we had one male cluster where we investigated and found a dead kitten, cougar kitten. That was the first time we ever found one. So we didn't know where this litter came from, but a male had clustered where he killed a kitten. And then we've had a couple other kittens that were tracked on our project. So from collared females giving birth, that we tag them and go and investigate, and they've been killed by a male cougar. We see the cougar tracks or signs that it's a cougar and not a bear. But we have had more bears kill cougar kittens than male cougars. So that's why I showed that kind of video of the close encounters with black bears, because we actually think that's a bigger problem than male cougars killing the kittens themselves. That bears are likely playing a bigger role given how many more we've had from black bears and close encounters. We've also had, I think, to go back and look at the numbers, it's only 1 or 2 cougars killed by another male cougar. And we've had 1 female killed by another cougar. And the female was killed by a cougar that's the same size as her. So we looked at her puncture marks on her skull, and she was killed by a cougar that had the teeth spacing or canine spacing of either an adult female or a juvenile male. So females killing another female is not very common in cougar populations. However, this is why I suspect it is a female that killed one of our females, because we had this female collared C10 for a couple of years and then went to a cluster or mort signal, and she was dead and cached, and all signs were only cougar tracks. So she was killed by another cougar, puncture marks to the head that were small. And then we collared another female near that location a few weeks later. And that female was an adult female of the same size, and she was completely beat up and had scratches all over her. And so we were suspicious that this other female actually killed our other female and took over her territory. But that's conjecture from the evidence we saw. We couldn't get DNA evidence from the cougar that was killed to match it up. But we haven't had any males in that area that would fit the bill. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, female potentially killed by another female, and at least 1 male killed by another male, an adult.
Awesome. Thanks. It's all these individual animals that are so fascinating. I was wondering if during your literature review, if you found any info related to the impact of collars on cougars and kill success ratio. So I guess the question is, does collaring cougars, or is there any research that looks at whether or not putting collars on cougars affects their ability to hunt and kill?
Yeah, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one that looked at this. I'm sure there are studies on collars themselves on any animal to see how much it impacts them. We don't find that collaring them changes their behavior from what we can tell. I mean, we're obviously not able to monitor them before we can collar them. But they have normal kill rates when we monitor them. So they cross huge amounts of area. They have big territories. They're doing normal cougar things. And we put trail cameras up and look in real time, you know, on the cameras, how they're acting after they've been collared. And we don't see anything to suggest that the collars themselves are influencing their behavior in any way. They're still able to kill adult moose. You know, they can take down deer, no problem. We don't see any effect of cougars being incapable of killing their main prey. All of the cougars that we've collared have been able to take down large ungulates with regular rates that we see in other studies. And so maybe collectively all the studies, you know, may are missing something, but we don't see starvation or anything like that. We haven't had anything that could suggest that the collar is negatively impacting their ability to feed themselves or do regular cougar things, reproduce or anything. Yeah.
Okay, and there was a question tied to reproduction, which I think was tied to the collar question, but I think what you're saying is you haven't seen anything, there's nothing in the literature that suggests that collars are, okay, perfect. And then I guess, we should wrap it up here. We're out of questions. So the big question is, knowing what you know about Chloe's work and what you've learned, and kind of the impetus to this was around restoring mule deer populations. What's the take-home message here?
Yeah, well, this is something Chloe and I discussed because, on the surface, it can seem like some of our results don't align. For example, my cougars killing mule deer around Cublox and Burns, and her study showing that those features are good for deer, right? And so we were talking about this and how what we think is happening is that these features are overall supporting deer populations and their fitness, and it's an energetic trade-off between selecting forage and birth locations that are good for deer, and they select these areas where there are Cublox and Burns with lots of food, despite the risk that predators can get them. So even though cougars are killing those deer there, I mean, I'm only looking at the ones they get, right? And not looking at all the other deer that are alive using those features that probably far outnumber the ones that are killed. And so they still are likely beneficial to mule deer in terms of long-term fitness, despite cougars killing them. And so, while from my perspective, I find that those features facilitate cougar predation, there can be some management actions that we take to make that less the case, to make it harder for cougars to kill them. We can design our Cublox better so that there's not so much harsh edge that benefit these predators. And if you're trying to grow mule deer populations and you want that good forage and good birth habitat, then we can make it a little bit safer for them in terms of the way these blocks are being cut. For example, I don't know how much we can do about fire, natural fire spreading, right? But in terms of the cut blocks, it might be the simpler one to start managing. And like in the picture, I showed how convoluted some of those shapes are, how much perimeter is there, right? And retention patches add to that edge effect. So I think the management implications are there, that we know those are good habitats for deer from Chloe's work and promote long-term fitness. But if we want to minimize the negatives, there might be some things we can do to manage some of those edges for cougars.
Awesome. Okay, and the stem density piece, I feel like plays a big part of it. I know we don't have necessarily the tools to take a good look at that, but but it's a big, that's the biggest change on the landscape is 100 years of fire suppression and how that interacts, and kind of what you're showing too near these cut blocks. I mean, it's a bit of a mess. So, okay.
Totally.
Well, thank you again. I guess we'll have you on for one more because you're going to defend hopefully here. I guess probably end of this year, next year, early next year, something like that.
Yeah, I'm hoping for the spring of 2025. Fingers crossed.
Awesome. So then we'll have you on for one more after that, and then cut you loose onto a postdoc or a new job. So thank you very much. Really appreciate all your hard work on that. Lots of compliments in the questions as well. Thanks everyone for tuning in. As always, feel free to share this on your networks and social media with your friends, families, neighbors. Our next conservation webinar is actually October 19th with Dr. Paul Hesburgh, looking at fire ecology and the relationship between fire, hydrology, and wildlife restoration. Dr. Hesburgh is another big name in the world of fire ecology and land management. So hope to see you all there. Thanks again, Siobhan. Thanks, Philippe, in the background for doing all of the Zoom, Facebook Live, all of that stuff. Philippe did post a link to that paper out of north of Revelstoke and south of Revelstoke on cougars and caribou. So hope you all had a great night. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Siobhan.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jesse.
See ya.